Hey guys, welcome to another video. Today we're going to be talking about wheelbase and how wheelbase affects drifting is going to be the next video. So it's really interesting. We're going to be doing something right now. I'm going to be discussing wheelbase of different drift cars right now and my own little input on that. And then you guys can comment and tell me how you guys feel about it. And I'll make the second video about the whole wheelbase subject based on you guys' comment. So if you have a drift car, or if you do a lot of sim drifting, or if you went from an E36 to a Z, or from an S13 to a Corvette, please comment below and let me know how you feel about it. If you have the notion that the wheelbase made a lot of difference, any other input you may have, just comment it below. And the next video I'll be making next week, and we'll be discussing all you guys' replies. So let's dive into this. Let's look at the various wheelbase of various different popular drift cars. We gotta start somewhere. Let's have a look at the Nissan's, obviously still very popular drifting chassis, and we even see a guy like Simon Olsen go back to the S chassis. Now he's driving with Audi, and also in Europe a guy like Paweł Korpulinski went back from the newer BMW chassis to building a brand new S14. So there's definitely something there in the S chassis. As you guys know, I really like them. And yeah, if we look at the S13, it's obviously the car, one of the cars with the shortest wheelbase, with 97.4 inches. Which is 24.75 millimeters, so just under 2.5 meters. We're going to keep this in inches just to keep it a little bit easier. The way I see it, I think my target audience, or like the amount of viewers, is like 87% are American or something like that. So let's just do this stuff in inches. It's pretty easy to calculate back. You just multiply by 2.54 if you're a European, but like the number in inches is a little bit smaller, so it's a little easier to compare. So you're on 97, a little over 97 inches for the S13, which is very, very short, as we're going to see in this list. On the S chassis, obviously, we also got to keep in mind this is a car which is a front sump, so it means the motor is a little bit further forward than, for instance, on a BMW or especially on a Corvette. And those things obviously also play a role. Again, I'm not saying something is worse or something is better. I'm not saying short wheelbase is better or worse. In this video, we'll just first talk about which cars have which wheelbase, and then we're going to go further into the different range of thoughts on that. So S14, S15 is obviously a little bit more, 99.4, which is still under 100 inches wheelbase. Car is a little bit taller, not much, it's a little bit longer. If we go to the Z's, the 350Z is something super interesting. On the 350Z, you're on 104 inches wheelbase, which is a lot more compared to the S14, S15. It's over 4 inches more. The real interesting thing is going to happen when we're looking at a 370Z, because the 370Z is on 100 inches wheelbase. So you're on 104 inches for the 350Z and 100 inches for the 370Z. If you look at the G37 and the G35, great cars. I love seeing them drive. Jonathan Cash obviously drove one in FD. 112 inches, which is a lot. 2850 millimeter for that car. It's obviously also a pretty big car. The funny thing is that all these cars in our list, if I just look at them, they're all around 170 inches total length. So the total length of the car is all around 4.5, so 4.6 meters, so around that 170 to 175 inches total length of the car. Where the G37, G35 is 183 inches, so that's a pretty big car. But that's obviously why they drift pretty well, I guess. Wheelbase makes it a little bit easier, obviously. So the Nissans, it's really interesting. S13 by far the shortest, 97.4. The S14, S15 only 2 inches longer than that. Then the 350Z, and this is what a lot of people don't know. A lot of people don't believe me. They Google it when I'm telling them this. But it's 104 inches, 350Z, pretty long wheelbase. Then the 370Z is on 100, and then the G37, G35 is on 112. Then let's take a look at the BMW. It's obviously a super popular chassis in Europe. When I started drifting, everybody had E30s or E34s, which is a super popular car for drifting. E36 was back then, was kind of like the M3 was still a pretty expensive car. E36 M3s were around 30 or 35,000 euros back then. I'm talking about way back, like 2003, 2004, something like that. So the E30 was in Europe the car that dominated. Like guys won King of Europe, guys won Nürburgring Drift Cup with E30s. A lot of people put V8s up front in the E30s. M60s obviously a very easy engine to get in Europe out of the 7 Series and the 5 Series, and a lot of people in Europe put them in the E30s. There's also something really interesting to talk about when we go through the wheelbase thing, is the engine placement. So let's first look at the wheelbase. The E30 is on 101 inches, and that car is only 170 inches short. So it's actually a shorter car than an S13, and the wheelbase is about 3 inches taller than an S13. So 101 inches for the E30. But keep in mind that these cars are family cars, so they're made to be 4-seater. So it's a lot of these drift cars are 2-seaters or 2+2s, like an S14 basically is not really a family car. It may have a rear seat, but it's like what I would call a 2+2, where the Corvettes and all these cars like Z's, they're all obviously 2-seaters. So that's also interesting. The E30 is like a 4-seater car. They made it as a sedan. It's 101 inches wheelbase. E36, one of my favorite cars, obviously, because it's pretty light. It's a little bit lighter than an E46. It's on 106 inches, and that car is 174 inches total. So that's about the same size, the same outside size as an S13, S14. But the wheelbase is on 106 inches, and the E46 is obviously a very similar car to the E36, and it's on 107 inches. So it's only an inch longer. But if you look obviously at the 350Z, that's 3 inches shorter than an E46. The E46 is way longer wheelbase than obviously the S14, S15, but also a long wheelbase than that 350Z, which is one of the longest wheelbase popular chassis in the Nissan world. So if you look at the newer BMWs, E90 is even on 108, so it's easy to remember. E36 is 106, E46 107, and E90 is 108. Pretty easy to remember. Actually, the F30 is on 110. Jordan's car, the M3, is really long wheelbase, basically almost the same as G37, G35. Obviously, these cars are getting bigger. The 3 Series are getting bigger and bigger throughout the years. If you look at the F30 versus the E30, which is of course 30 years in between, that's 10 inches wheelbase difference, and both cars are 3 Series. That's pretty interesting. If you look at the F22, that's on 105. So the F22 is actually shorter wheelbase than the E36. It's super interesting. One thing I wanted to say about the BMW is the engine placement. If you look at the E30, people put M60s in E30s and all these other motors like S38, the E34 M5 motor, and it sits right in front of the steering rack. So your sump just almost hits the steering rack, and then it's like close to the firewall in the E30. And it was like the go-to engine swap in Europe for any drift car. Like everybody had M60 E30s. It was like if you had an event with 30 cars, 20 of them were an E30 with an M60 or an S62 V8. And we did a lot of swaps. I think I've swapped at least 15 cars into an M60 or an S62, E30s that is. So on the E30, the sump sits in front of the rack. And on the E36, it's obviously a problem to fit the M60 because the firewall sits further back. And that's the mistake that people make. They think that on an E30, it just falls right into place. And on the E36, it just doesn't fit, and it fits bad and whatever. But that's not because of the subframe placement. That's because of the firewall. So the E36 firewall sits way further back. That's really interesting. When I went to Estonia to visit Weissfab, I attended a couple drifting events there. And on many drifting events, I saw many cars which had an M60 up front, and they were E36s. And they were placed the way they were placed in an E30 with the normal 7 Series and 5 Series sump. So they had a gap like this much between the cylinder heads and the firewall. And those guys drifted great with those cars because if you think about it, you could win European Series. You can still win a lot of grassroots events with an E30 with an M60. No problem, right? Nobody's going to say, oh, an E60 or M60 V8 in an E30 is a bad drifting car. It's a great drifting car. But you could do the exact same thing in an E36. It just looks dumb because the motor sits pretty far from the firewall. You know what I'm saying? So it sits in the same location compared to the front axle, because an E30 and an E36 front axle are almost interchangeable. You can put E36 and E46 control arms on E30s. That's actually what we did. So you can put an E36 rack in an E30, so like the subframe and the control arms and the whole front suspension of an E30 is very much akin to an E36. So if you're really ghetto or you just want like a fun seat time car, you can get an M60 and just put it with a front sump in an E36, and it will look stupid. Just don't open the hood. But the weight balance is actually better because the cabin on the E36 sits further back than in the E30. And the placement of the motor is the same over the front axle as an E30, which is a V8 E30 is a great drift car. So that's always one of those things that opened my eyes. We didn't really do many M60 E36 cars for that reason, because I was always like, yeah, well, it needs to be rear sump, it's difficult, it basically needs to be dry sump. Obviously, Brian and me did the video about converting his M60 motor that's in his E36. You can watch that video on how the oil pump had to be modified and all this stuff. But like, if you don't really care, you can just put that motor right in front of the front axle on that car. So that's pretty interesting. So summarizing, E30 101 inches, E36 106, E46 107, E90 108, and then 110 is for the F30. And the F22 is on 105 inches, so super interesting. Obviously, the newer chassis, well, newer like E36, E46, E90, they have the motor a little bit placed further back than the E30. So again, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Like, I think that the E30 has a motor placement that's similar to an S13 and an S14. Because if you put an LS or a JZ in an S chassis, it sits further forward than it does in a BMW E46 or E36. But people win FD rounds with them. So is that really bad that the motor sits a little bit further forward? It's up to you. So that's right now the numbers on the E30s, E36, E46, E90. Yeah, so let me know what you guys think about those BMW wheelbases, and maybe that's a thing, because we're going to be looking at the whole summary, and 106 and 107. I can already tell you, 106, 107 inches wheelbase is going to be one of the longest wheelbases in this list. So maybe that's why E36, E46 drift so easy or so well. But let's take a look at the Corvettes right now. Obviously, for me, that's kind of special. The Corvettes are a car that's like a new chassis for me. Weisfab just made the kit for it just about 2 years ago. I did a lot of the development driving for that with Richard Advani driving the car and giving us the feedback and all that stuff. So for me, the Corvette kit really feels like my baby. So I'm super happy that we can now offer the Corvette kit. Obviously, I made my own C6, the road legal car, this year, or basically end of last year and beginning of this year, and I'm building a new C6 Pro car with a really crazy NA motor. So for me, that's a very special car. I always loved Corvettes. The C5 and the C6 are basically the only Corvettes that are being driven on any scale. Sadly, not the C4, which is also a chassis that I love a lot, but it's not really a popular drift car. So if you look at the C5 and C6, something really funny going on. So the C5 is 179 inches long and the C6 is 174 inches long. So the car is a little shorter. So the C6, the total length of the C6 is actually short. If you look at the wheelbase, then the C5 is 104 and the C6 is 105 inches. And if we see how that stacks up to other cars, that's about the same as the 350Z. So the 350Z is wheelbase wise is right in between the C5 and the C6. It's actually a C5 and a C6 both have a shorter wheelbase than the E36. So a lot of people say, oh yeah, the Corvette, you can really tell has a long wheelbase. You never hear that about an E36 or 350Z. Nobody ever said, never heard anybody say, you can really tell the 350Z is such a long wheelbase. Nobody ever says that. But like the Corvette's similar wheelbase to a 350Z. On the C5, there's actually one advantage. So the rack placement of the C5 is a little bit better than on the C6. On the C6, the rack sits a little bit further forward because those came supercharged. And yeah, so on the C5, the rack position is arguably a little bit better. Those cars are, like I said, 179 inches, 174 inches long. So the C5 has a little more overhang than the C6, funnily. Yeah, so that's one of those things. Also, the center of gravity is obviously also a thing. So these cars are very low. It's a sports car. It has double wishbone suspension. It doesn't have a lot of McPherson's going all the way to the top of the car. Like if you look at a S14, the McPherson struts in the rear go all the way to the partial shelf. So it needs to be very structural up high. And same with the BMWs. They're all McPherson cars, which means that the chassis has to be really beefy high up all the way to the hood level, it has to be a very beefy chassis, because that's where all those suspension forces are going to go. And on the Corvette, obviously, that level of strength only has to go as high as the frame rails, because that's where the suspension bolts to. So those cars don't have to be structural at all any higher up than the frame rails, because that's all just covers and aerodynamics, just covering the wheels. So that's all there is. There's no structure at all above the wheel in a Corvette, where BMW or S chassis, they have obviously a steel structure there for the suspension strut. So that's also a thing, like those cars, a lot of Corvettes, like they seem like they have a way longer wheelbase when you see them drive, but it's probably also because they're lower, so they look a lot more sleek. Like the 350Z is a lot higher. My buddy Chris Finch, who's not a small guy, he obviously, like myself, everybody struggles with cages in Corvettes because there's just not a lot of room, especially if you're a little bit bigger. And the 350Z for him has way more room inside. Like you can put a cage in there, and it's like a cage 350Z probably has more room than a Corvette without a cage. So that's also a thing. The center of gravity on those cars is a lot higher, and the whole car is a lot taller. So even if you look at an S13 and an E46, E46 is way taller. Like I'm currently building an S14. Obviously, we've built a lot of E36s, E46s. It's probably 4 inches difference from the floor to the roof with an S14 versus an E46. And E90 is even more. E90 is probably 5 inches difference, just the height from the floor to the roof. And that makes obviously a lot of difference as well. Like wheelbase is one of those parameters that's easy to find for people, and they always talk about it. But we should also look at things like where is the center of gravity on those cars, what's the overhang, and obviously the total height of the car, because it's all steel that goes up front. I know BMW developed the E46 M3 CSL, which is a car that I drove a lot, and I drove a lot of normal E46s, and then I drove a CSL, and you can really tell the weight savings there in the roof. So it just counts so much if you have like a little bit more height in the car. You can really tell if you drive a BMW with a carbon roof or a BMW with a normal sunroof, which is probably between 25 and 30 pounds difference after all is said and done. But it sits so high up that it makes a really big difference. Like you can just tell, even on the street you can tell if you do a little bit of spirited driving. So you can imagine that if that even makes that much difference, how much difference does 4 inch of roof height make? Like that's a massive thing. So I think that's also one of the things on the Corvette, like the center of gravity of them is very low. They have a pushrod motor from the factory, obviously. It's also the motor with the best center of gravity, shortest motor you can get, most compact motor. So yeah, that all plays a role in that for the Corvettes. Now we're looking at the biggest manufacturer in the world, Toyota. A really good brand, obviously, very strong drifting history. Along with Ford, one of the brands that's backing drifting, which is really important to me, really cool. They also keep making these simple, cheap-ish new sports cars with a manual, which is obviously great. None of us are buying them brand new, so Aaron's always saying like, yeah, we're always bitching that nobody makes these manuals, and we're always bitching that these cars, that nobody makes affordable sports cars, and then Toyota makes these affordable rear-wheel drive cars, and none of us buy them. And I'm like, well, you're actually absolutely right, like shame on us. But Toyota, obviously, let's just start with the GT86, which is a popular chassis right now in Europe. Obviously, the Shanahan brothers drive them. More and more people are building them. It's not my favorite chassis, and I think it's mostly because the frame rails are really wide, because I have to accommodate a boxer motor from the factory. And the rear shocks are very short. I don't really love the rear suspension on them, to be perfectly honest. Obviously, it's a very capable drift car, because if you see what the Shanahan guys are doing with it, obviously Wisweb also developed the front kit for it, which put the rack in the front, which is a good thing. Like I love cars with the rack up front, and Wisweb obviously made the V3 for the S chassis, and Wisweb made the front rack conversion for the GT86. Which is what Taguchi drove. He drove 86 with the rack up front, and he won in St. Louis, which is amazing, of course. Not saying it's because of that, obviously. Stay out of the comments, but or comment, whatever. But yeah, so that's a really good thing. That's obviously a potential chassis, and it's good for sponsors because it's a little bit of a newer car. They're also easier to find in good shape, like most S13s or E36s. They're obviously trashed and rusted, and it takes you like 2 weeks just to get the chassis like kind of like decent. Where if you just get some salvage title, GT86 is probably a car you can start working on right away. So yeah, that's a good car for sponsoring, whatever. Let's have a look at the wheelbase of those cars, which is 101 inches. which puts it on par with the BMW E30, and it's only a little bit longer wheelbase than the S14, S15. So that's pretty good wheelbase. The newer 86, the GR86 is the same. It's almost the same. It's a very, very small margin. It's slightly longer. It's like 101.1 or something. So those cars, GT86, GR86, 101 inches. For me, the frame wheels on the front are a little bit wide, so if you put like big wheels on them and you want to make full angle, the front of the car becomes super wide, actually wider than a Corvette. But guys have great results with it. Is it a car that I would build myself? Maybe, if I wanted to attract a certain type of sponsor, if I had Toyota backing, maybe. But yeah, I mean, cool car. It's not really a Wout car, I guess, but yeah. If we look at the Supra Mark IV, which is one of my favorite cars, I think that car looks amazing. We just built one. Blasphemy, put an LS in one, but that car is so good. Like, the weight balance of that car is crazy. And it's a larger GT that's made in a really good way. Like, I like the Porsche 928s, the Mercedes SL, BMW 850. They're all similar cars to me, to the Supra Mark IV. Really nice car. That car is on 98 inches wheelbase, guys. That's a super short wheelbase. That's shorter than an S14. A Mark IV Supra is a shorter wheelbase than an S14, and it's less than an inch longer than an S13. So that's a super short wheelbase. If you compare it to the Corvette, the best Corvette, a C5, arguably the best chassis for drifting, is on 104 inches. Mark IV Supra is on 98. If we look at the Supra Mark V, the A90 Supra that Frederik Asbo took to the championship, that's actually 97. So that's an inch shorter. So the Supra Mark V A90 is the same wheelbase as an S13, which is crazy if you think about it, because it's way newer and it's actually 4 inches shorter than a GT86. We can also look, obviously, at the suspension of that, which is BMW, because it's all almost the same. Like the Wisefab A90 kit is very similar to the BMW E90 kit. So obviously a very good car. The Supra Mark IV is also pretty good suspension. Supra Mark IV obviously is a wishbone type. Really like that a lot. I think I would love to build a Mark IV Supra drift car. I think they're super cool. Yeah, and the Supra Mark V, now a lot of people are building them. Piotr Wicek is building one. Kalle Rovanperä is putting one into DMAC. So yeah, that's basically a really good car to build right now. It's probably, if I wouldn't build a Corvette or a BMW, I would probably build a Supra Mark A90 Mark V. So good car. 97 inches, this is S13 wheelbase. I love it. What's really funny, my buddy Andy from Germany, he has a Soarer, which is a long car that's 191 inches long, which is very long. If I look at the list, it's even longer than an F30. Like an F30 BMW is 182 inches total length. The Soarer is 191 inches total length. The wheelbase of the Soarer is 105 inches. That's crazy, right? 105 inches. It's like, yeah, for an older car, like the newer cars tend to get a little bit more wheelbase, but like if you compare it to the Supra Mark IV, 98, and then the Soarer is 105. Of course, on the Toyota side of things, we cannot forget the Chaser, really cool car. It's also kind of like misunderstood size-wise. Like I said before in other videos, some people think it's like a BMW 5 Series or a 7 Series. They are not. They're actually pretty light. I always say it's like a BMW 3 Series, but then with a really long boot. So it's not really like a super luxury car. If you sit in them, it's always a little bit weird to me, because the first time I sat in one, I was like, this is small. It's like the size of an E36 or something on the inside. The wheelbase is a little bit over 107 inches for the Chaser, which is on par with the BMWs, of course. It's exactly the same as the E46. So yeah, Chaser, obviously a really good car for drifting. They come with a really good motor from the factory. Brandon Wicknick loaned me one for FD Utah, a really cool car. Definitely a car that I see myself driving at some point, but I guess I missed the boat with the prices. But they slot in right between the BMWs with 107 inches wheelbase. So Toyota, really interesting. GT86, GR86 are on 101 inches. And the Supra Mark IV and Mark V are on 97 and 98, so that's pretty short. One of the shortest wheelbases in our list, actually. So interesting stuff there. Obviously, I don't want to forget the Miata guys and the other Mazda guys. I really love the Miatas. We're not making a kit for them right now because we're not really too sure if it's like the kind of target audience for us, because most of the Miatas are maybe more like an entry-level grassroots kind of car. And if we had to make a locket for it, it would probably end up costing the same as the locket that we already have for the RX-8 and we already have for the NC Miata and for the FD. So that's probably, it's not the simplest kit to make. So yeah, no, sadly no NA or NB Miata kits right now, guys. Sorry for that. I know a lot of you guys ask. Obviously, that's going to be a car with the shortest wheelbase in this list, 89 inches for an NB Miata. It's a super short. It's almost 10 inches shorter than even an S13. Crazy, crazy. It's also a very short car, obviously 156 inches total length, which is by far shorter. It's almost 20 inches shorter than a Corvette C6. So that's nuts if you think about it. So 89 inches wheelbase. If you look at the FD RX-7, one of my favorite cars, super good looking car. Like, I love how they look. I would love to have one. Obviously, it would be cool to have a rotary one or even an LS swap one. That car is on 95 inches wheelbase, so that's a pretty short wheelbase. 95 inches for the FD is shorter than the Mark IV Supra. It's shorter than an S13, so that's pretty good. So the Mazdas right now, NB Miata and the FD RX-7 are super short wheelbases, 89 inches and 95 inches. Obviously, we can't leave the Fords behind. Ford Mustang. I love big cars. I started out drifting E28s and E34s, which is, of course, in the wheelbase game. They're not really huge, but they're like pretty big cars, like a 5 Series. I love seeing bigger cars drift. My buddy Chelsea De Nova, obviously a big Mustang guy right now with RTR. It's really cool. If you think of Chelsea's career, it's really funny because he was like a big BMW guy, but also a Mazda guy. And now he's a Ford guy, so he's obviously also still a BMW and a Mazda guy, but pretty interesting career path there. If we look at the S550, the car that's currently being drifted, or like up until now, because I believe they're fielding S650s right now, they're 107 inches. 107 inches wheelbase. The funny thing is the Mustang 197, the model before that, is also 107 inches, which is the same as an E46. It's pretty interesting. So S550, it's a pretty big car. It looks really huge on track, but the wheelbase is 107 inches, which is the same as an E46. The Fox body Mustang, obviously Chelsea is now getting to grips with that chassis. That's on 100 inches, so it's pretty funny. The S14, S15 is basically the same as a Fox body Mustang. So if we're looking at the list, the cars with the shortest wheelbase is obviously the Mazda NB Miata, 89 inches. Then there's 95 inches for the FD Mazda RX-7 FD, really short, 95 inches. Then 97 inches for the Supra A90 Mark V. 97 as well for the S13 Nissan, which is a really short wheelbase, the shortest wheelbase for the popular Nissans. 98 inches for the Mark IV Supra. 99 inches for the S14, S15, and the 370Z is on 100 inches, which is the same as the Fox body Mustang. So the S13, S14, and 370Z and Fox body Mustang are all really, really close together. It's almost the same wheelbase. If we go to the wheelbase that's over 100 inches, Toyota with the GT86 and the GR86, they're on 101, which is the same as a BMW E30. Then on 104 inches, the Corvette C4, but also the 350Z, which is a lot longer wheelbase, obviously, than the 370Z, as we spoke about. That's like the weirdest thing in this video. On 105 inches, we have the Soarer and we have the Corvette C6 and the BMW F22. They're all on 105 inches. And if we go over 105 inches, it's the E36 with 106, it's the E46 with 107, and it's both the newer Mustangs, so the S550 and the S197, they're both on 107. E90 BMW is 108, and the F30 BMW is 110. It's also really funny. My buddy in Germany, Kenny, he just built a Panamera. Well, he built it a couple years ago, but he's driving it this weekend for the first time. A Porsche Panamera is 114 inches. So that's pretty funny. That's 10 inches longer than a Corvette. Interesting over there. So thank you guys for watching the video. Interesting. Let me know what you guys think about this. For me, the biggest eye-opener, well, I kind of knew in the back of my head that Supra a 90 Mark V at such a short wheelbase for a pretty new car, but like 97 inches for the current Supra. Yeah, it's pretty short. Again, is it good? Is it bad? Like, that's another thing. Everybody who ever drove an E36 or an E46 is going to say that car drives so easy. Such a great car to drive. And when I drove a Mustang for the first time, I had the same feeling. It was like, oh, these cars are really easy to drive. However, the Corvettes are also pretty close to the E36 wheelbase, but they're a completely different car. I feel like the E36 is a little bit more floaty, and the Corvette, if you don't apply throttle, it just stops drifting. So the difference between side bite and forward bite on an E36 or a Corvette is huge. I would say that the Corvette is one of the most forward bite cars there is, and the E36 is probably one of the best side bite cars there is. It's funny because they're both the same wheelbase. It goes to show that there's a lot of difference over there. Obviously, the suspension is miles apart between the Corvette and the E46. For me, I have the E46 Pro cars back home. I have the E46 M3 Pro car or Drift Week car in America, and they're pretty close wheelbase wise, but cars couldn't be any different. McPherson up front, trailing arm out back for the E46, where it's wishbones all around for the Corvette. And obviously the Corvette is the V8. It's a two-seater. You sit way further back. The motor sits further back, and on the E46, center of gravity is a lot lower. So it goes to show that wheelbase doesn't really mean everything. However, it's one of the things you can't really change. So if you choose a 370Z, you just get 4 inches less wheelbase than if you take a 350Z. So that's just, you can never change that. So it's one of those parameters. Like, you can obviously swap in a motor. You can do all kinds of things with those cars. You make them lighter. You can change the weight around, but you can't really change the wheelbase. So let me know what you guys think. Thank you guys so much for watching.